It's hard for me to talk to you about privacy when I'm not sure what you mean when you talk about privacy. I'm not really sure what I mean when I talk about privacy. Certainly there's this feeling like it's some basic human right. If that's the case, why doesn't it show up in our Bill of Rights? I mean, the founders were pretty good about thinking about the basic liberal rights of society, of freedom and of expression and how you needed to protect those. So why doesn't the word privacy show up in any of those, or frankly in any of the amendments afterwards? I mean, legal scholars talk a little bit about how you can find it if you look really carefully, that it's kind of implied in other rights, in the Fourth and the Fifth, for example, that there are suggestions that might say that there was something that looks a little bit like privacy. They talk about something called the penumbra of the Bill of Rights. That is the kind of the edge, the fuzzy edge of the shadow that privacy somehow hides in. But when it comes right down to it, they didn't say you have the right to privacy. That's something that has been inferred by the courts. And even then, it's not quite sure what that means when you have it. There's a whole set of rights that often are called privacy that are encoded in different state laws, for example. Things about whether people can see your health records, for example, or whether someone can take a picture of you and distribute it more widely, or whether someone can take a picture of you and then put it in a context that it wasn't initially expected to be in, and by that put you in a false light. That doesn't seem anything like my gut feeling for what privacy is. I mean, the core feeling for what privacy might be is this, as one of the initial justices to talk about this said, this right to be left alone. If you let me alone, that's a kind of privacy. I demand some personal privacy, which means don't interfere with what I'm doing and go away, right? So maybe that's one of those core ideas of privacy. Privacy as a right really doesn't come along until a couple of guys write about it in a law journal in 1890. They write an article called The Right to Privacy. It's instructive to think about where that article came from, and it came from a group of very rich Bostonites who were upset that because there were now cameras that could be hidden, that servants who were coming to their lavish parties could take pictures of those parties, and because of the new technologies of printing, could then publish those pictures of those parties in the newspaper, and the very poor people of Boston would feel as if they were wasting money and being ridiculously extravagant. In other words, it was an anti-paparazzi, in some way, as an anti-paparazzi argument. And eventually the court did, the courts in the U.S. did recognize some form of rights to privacy. It wasn't actually that one to start with. It was around advertising. An image of her was used as a kind of a spokesperson, not really, but an image to advertise flour, and she had no idea that it was going to be used that way, and they kind of stole her image to do that. So that was the first set of laws, but there's this whole range of things. So is that still privacy? Part of the reason we have a problem with privacy is that it is so difficult to define. And I think one of the reasons it's difficult to define is the word we use, the ideas we have around privacy are just completely enmeshed with technology and with kind of the move towards urbanity, this technological society. We wouldn't have that article, The Right to Privacy, if cameras had not been miniaturized, and if mass printing was not available for, halftone printing was not available for newspapers, and if people weren't living in such close proximity in cities. That one's a little iffier, because people have lived in cities for a long time, and the idea of the rich people and the poor people, or the rich people and the slaves in some cases, living in very close proximity is not that unusual. But the technological part of it that allows them to see, record, redistribute these images seems to create a new need, a new right that is a right not to be recorded using these technologies. And if you look at the history, again, mostly the legal history in the United States of privacy, it is often built up around what kinds of technologies do different things to how we interact with one another. So, for example, it's fair to say that if you bug someone's telephone, that is maybe an invasion without a warrant. that is maybe an invasion of their Fourth Amendment prohibitions against search and seizure. But what if you bug them at a payphone? Because that's in public, right? But you're having a private conversation in public. So all of this kind of question of public and private and how you can write laws that define those gets very tricky very quickly. I think part of the reason we're running into that right now is just that. Yeah, right. We have new kinds of technologies that we didn't have before that create new kinds of threats of surveillance and of violation of privacy. And so the word privacy begins to take on different meanings as new technologies emerge. So much so that I suspect that the word privacy, which wasn't used very widely, privacy has been used as a word for many centuries, but wasn't used in this kind of sense of recording things and redistributing them. I think that's an artifact of the last century. I think it's a 20th century word that has just kind of managed to bleed over into the 21st century. And I suspect that over time we will lose the use of that word, or at least it won't mean the same kinds of things that it meant 10 years ago or even today. So if it's disappearing, we can at least start to think about how we can tease out some of the elements of what privacy, and especially internet privacy, consists of. Or let's go more broadly than the internet and just talk about sort of digital privacy, how new technologies affect privacy. And so really you could break this down into the fact that new technologies are now creating new opportunities for collecting information that didn't exist before, and that they create new opportunities for analyzing and combining that information. Both of those are kind of separate kinds of threats to what we consider privacy right now. I suspect that the second one is going to have a much larger effect on what we think of as privacy and about how we think about surveillance than new techniques or technologies for observing things. So let me bring that down to more concrete pieces. There's exotic new technologies for measuring things, right? Some of this had to do with, partially because it was funded well, is how can the TSA figure out if you're up to no good? And so sure, they can run your bag through an X-ray, which they've done for several decades, and they can run you through a magnetometer to make sure you aren't bringing large chunks of metal in the plane, and they've done that for several decades. But we have now the body scanners, and we have equipment that can sniff plumes of chemicals. There's some of you may have been in the thing that you go in and it blows air through you and collects it up at the top and looks for any chemicals that might be signatures of explosives. As an aside, the guy who invented that in the patent suggests that it could also be used for taking DNA samples without actually touching someone. That if you could collect sweat and skin and stuff in that plume, you could find out not only who the person was and have a record of their DNA potentially, once we have the technologies for doing much quicker analysis of DNA, but you could also find out if they had traces of other people's DNA on them. This gets very, very, right now that's not a technology we have, but it's certainly not outside of the bounds of possibility. We have things like drones, right? The drone sizes have gotten down to being insect sized, and so you much more easily have a drone sitting on your windowsill and not know it. And I suspect we'll have more of that. We have terrestrial imaging from satellites, which used to be completely sort of within the world of kind of spy novels, but now there are commercial versions of the traditionally state-owned forms of surveillance. So there's a possibility of collecting that. Although in some ways that's not even necessary, right? Because the data streams will tell you about that. Now there's a little bit more protection about this, but for a long time, both Apple and Google were collecting where you went over time. That your phone provided basically a bug to track your movements over space for anybody who was holding a phone. So you have a lot of these new technologies can collect sort of in the background, can collect streams of what you're doing. Every key press, everything you type, everything you ask for online, everything you say to Alexa, all of these create a huge amount of data that has always been there to some extent, but was never captured and retained. Data is so cheap to retain now that you can keep records of pretty much whatever anyone does on the internet over time. And the video piece, besides drones, the video piece is becoming much more important, right? So people take many more pictures in social media, and even if they're not doing that, the cost of cameras, you can put a camera in anything for less than $1 at this point, for less than 25 cents. You can put a small, low-resolution camera in not just your phone, but your fridge and everywhere else. And so I suspect, over the next 5 or 10 years, we'll start to see a proliferation of cameras in everything. It won't just be your doorbell or your phone, but your fridge and any other electronic device is likely to throw a mic and a camera in there, because we'll be much more accustomed to doing using those as interfaces. And so and it's very cheap to do at this point. So we have these huge streams of visual data now coming in, and we have the ability of doing facial recognition. That moves over into a slightly different area, which is our second piece, which is this question of, even with all of those ways of collecting data about me, even with, again, some of this I actually contribute myself, things like a Fitbit and fitness trackers. So even with all those increased streams of potential things to tap and to find out about you with, it doesn't really matter that much until you start to combine them. So the data protection laws in Germany and in much of Europe are much stronger than they are in the United States. In some ways, we've had to play catch-up. And part of the reason for that is that they have a much stronger history of their governments creating dossiers and being able to track people down and use that to make their lives hell or to make their lives end. And so there's a little bit more of, even though we think of Americans, the prototypical American as being anti-government, I think you don't think the same thing about Europeans for the most part. They generally are not as virulently anti-government or anti-authoritarian, but they have had much more recent experience in many parts of Europe with governments that go bad. And so, the response in the U.S. is to protect Second Amendment rights and say, we're going to defend ourselves with guns if the government comes after us. In Europe, often it's a question of saying, we are going to make sure that the government can't keep the same kind of personal records and dossiers of citizens, so that you'll be harder to find. They may be able to find your guns, but they won't find you, which might be more important in many ways. And so their much more recent actual experience with government overreach has created a situation where they're more concerned about the kinds of records that are kept and how they're combined. So, chances are you've seen the notices over the last however much of time where, because of new European Union laws, they have to tell you what they're collecting about you and whether they're putting cookies on your machine and various things like that. And if you are operating a service in Europe, you have to do things like adhere to their rules about right to be forgotten. So if someone decides they don't want to be on your site, you have to remove them from your site. You can't keep those records any longer. So there is some more thought around the question of privacy in terms of combination there than there is here. Those kinds of combinations are not just government dossiers, of course. In fact, because there is the very little privacy law we have in the United States includes a privacy law in 1976 that said, officially at least, the U.S. government could not share data that they'd collected in various agencies with one another. This is coming to a head with the question of whether state policing organizations have to collaborate with ICE, and even more so if kind of like the IRS, who actively collects income taxes from workers who have various immigration status in the U.S., whether they have to report that to ICE, for example, or whether whether schools have to. So this question of who's allowed to talk to whom is much more thorny in the case of the U.S. government than it is for private industry. Now, it's still not that thorny for them. Very few people have won any kind of case against the government for sharing their data. But generally speaking, it's kind of moot, because it's much easier for the government to buy these dossiers from one of a handful of companies that accumulate them on the web and don't have any of the same kind of restrictions the country agencies of the country do. So these private agencies, these private data collection and clearinghouses, can collect this data and combine it in ways that the government can't. So one example of that is, Google and Facebook, through agreements with much of the web, can already track many of the places you go and many of the things you search for, not just on Google and not just on Facebook, but if you go to a website and search for a pair of shoes, many of you have probably experienced this. Those shoes will then track you from site to site, delivering ads saying, "Hey, remember me? You wanted to buy me as shoes. I'm still here. I'm waiting for you. Adopt me. I'm your shoes." So they can do that because they have agreements with each of these companies that allow them to track your motion, track your movement from site to site. And that can be combined with other sources of data. For Google, they collect if you're using Gmail, they collect all of your emails and they can analyze those. As of last year, they started collecting your credit card information and combining your search and browsing histories with what you purchase online to create a bigger picture of you. You can collect things like images that people take. If you're in a shop and you purchase something and they have a surveillance camera, and many of them do, they now have a picture of you that they can associate with your name and associate with this larger dossier. And then they can use facial recognition to find when you walk into the next store. So what has been happening online can now happen to a much greater degree offline. When you walk into a store, they can now know who you are, what you've purchased in the past, what kinds of things you like to purchase, what your clothing sizes are. All this data can be, in many cases it's not right now, but can be available to them very quickly. Google is also, Amazon and Google and a number of others are looking to sell this facial recognition technology to whoever needs it, including governments and private businesses. So the problem comes not necessarily in the original data being collected, but with it being shared, put places where you didn't expect it to go. And then once it's shared, being combined in ways that give people a picture of you that you might not have realized was being assembled. In fact, they may know more about you than you realize or than you know yourself. And that can be really tricky. The other piece of this is they might know more about you than even they themselves know. So particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, a big piece of the research and a lot of the buzz in these circles is around deep learning. And deep learning is great for a lot of things. I was just at the doctor and talking to my doctor about how, for the medical field, this is pretty amazing, because he was looking at some imagery of me, and he said he's been trained in it, and he actually brought it to another doctor who'd been trained in it, and they talked about it, talked over it. But he said a lot of that will be put into the hands of artificial intelligence and deep learning, because they can detect patterns that the human doctor might not be able to detect. And that's the case kind of across the board here, that these deep learning systems can make inferences about your behavior, about your beliefs, and hit them with some accuracy. This came up particularly in the Cambridge Analytica case, where it turns out that if they know enough about your likes online, just your likes, they said something that, they made this claim at least, that if they had 200 of your likes, they would be able to anticipate your other desires better than your spouse can if you're married. So that may not be a surprise to all of you who think that your spouse really just doesn't get you. But the idea that this artificial intelligence system does get you and can't quite explain why, that it can anticipate your interests, your desires better than any human can, and better than people around you can, that's kind of a scary idea. And that comes through not just combination, but this kind of extreme combination of throwing a whole bunch of unstructured data at a system that learns from everybody else's unstructured data and finds connections that no human ever would, and makes predictions that they can't quite explain but turn out to be true. So that's kind of the most extreme end of where we're headed. And so I think that I am one of those people who I don't get very worried about privacy, to be honest. I mean, I don't do anything wrong. I probably do lots of stuff wrong, but I at least convince myself that I don't do enough wrong that anyone would care about what I do. And so, there's other, I'm in a particular position in society that means that I'm not subject to some, at least at this point in my life, that I have a little bit more security, that I have some kind of defensive mechanisms socially around there. So I don't have to be as worried about it as someone who is in a more vulnerable position might. So that's part of it, I guess. But even when I was in a more tenuous social position, I still didn't worry too much about this. I think that that's pretty common. So I think if you talk to people, they'll say they're worried about stuff, but not enough to actually do anything about it. They get over it pretty quickly. And so I think that this is all going to come and bite us very quickly, because the kind of extreme learning that's going on, the extreme changes are happening mostly just under the surface. And by the time they kind of catch up with us and we know how these systems are tracking on us, if we find that out, I think people are going to be pretty upset. But for now, we're all blissfully unaware. If we don't want that to happen, what can we do in terms of policy? And this has been true not just now, but for many decades. We can turn to Europe and see what they're doing, and we could try to follow suit. Germany and France and Denmark and a number of other countries have ministerial level sort of data and privacy ombudsman. So they have a secretary of privacy, and that's not to serve the administration in those countries, but to make sure that the government isn't doing anything that invades people's own personal privacy. And we don't have anything like that. And we now have a number of policies that have been adopted in the European Union that, in some ways, American companies should just adopt. But many of them have just decided to say we'll only adopt these practices for our European clients. So, American Express was famous for this. This is a different safe harbor than the DMCA, but they made agreements with the Europeans that said that they could handle European data kind of within its own silo and make sure that they were following privacy restrictions on that data. But they weren't going to just follow the restrictions for Europeans and apply them to Americans, because it was too valuable a data source to be able to kind of data mine their private conversations, their private interactions, their activities online. In the case of American Express, their purchase patterns. And so that data was just too valuable to just give up. So it was easier for them as a business process to actually separate it out and say, we'll handle our European clients differently than we will our American clients. So obviously that's more expensive, but it was too valuable to give up the U.S. data without kind of leaking it over. That's pretty unusual, actually. California, people get upset with California because they tend to be pretty proactive on a number of fronts. And so, for example, for a long time you had California cars and non-California cars, but increasingly it's cheaper for manufacturers to make a car that is acceptable to California and then sell it across the U.S. I may have mentioned in another lecture that California has laws about privacy in terms of how websites can handle your data. So it needs to be handled within a secure socket if you're passing personally identifiable information or doing sales of any sort across the web. And so that's a California law, but obviously you're not going to set up a website for selling things online and sell things online to everyone except people who live in California. That's just stupid. So you just set up a system that works for California and provides extra protection, but is available to people throughout the U.S. or throughout the world. So California is trying to do this. What kinds of policy interventions are there? Well, some kind of, leaving aside the privacy issues, some kind of transparency policy would be useful. So even if I can't stop websites from collecting my data, making it clear what they collect and who they give it to, I think, is pretty essential. And not just in gobbledygook that I won't read. We now know that people just don't read user agreements. And even if you did read user agreements, I would challenge you to figure out what they're saying about what they share with whom. So I think there needs to be some kind of policy structure that insists on companies being more transparent about what they're collecting and how they're using it. Again, Europe has been much more on the forefront of some of these questions and putting this stuff forward. What about what we can do as strategies? Well, there are a couple of strategies we can take. One is kind of, we can call it kind of cover and flack. So on the cover side, we can be more careful about what we reveal to websites and to apps and to people online. It's weird to me that game apps on my phone ask me if they can have access to my location and my phone book. And no, you can't have access to that because I don't need that to play, Lockout or whatever. I don't. There's no reason that an occasional game needs to have access to any of that data. And some of it is just kind of Unity kind of encourages you to answer those questions yes, or to have those privacy questions come up and to have them covered. But some of it is overreach for sure. So we can do things like lock down our preferences in places like Facebook and social media platforms. We can think about our use. We can use a virtual private network, a VPN, to do a little bit of hiding of where we are. We can get more extreme, and although Tor is not entirely secure, for at least some of our things, we could pass them through Tor, and some of Tor's children, some of the things that have come up to replace Tor in terms of peer-to-peer masking of where you are and what you're doing. We can do things like not use not put our name out there, not put our phone numbers out there, to be cognizant of what we're putting out on the web. I got harassed by someone because they found my phone number because they'd seen my business card in a photo online. So, I didn't really care. So what? And it was annoying, and then I just blocked those numbers. But, that was just kind of, I didn't think about it. And so thinking about it is helpful at the very, very bare level. And then at the most extreme level, you can say, I'm only going to use Signal to talk to my friends, to text my friends, because then I have end-to-end encryption. I'm only going, I'm going to have systems that check to see if someone has a public key and encrypt my emails to them if they do. So even if I'm not sending encrypted email to everyone, at least those of us who have some kind of question over security, or some kind of if we lean towards the idea of covering up what we do and not being wide open about it, then at least I can kind of encourage that within the people who care about this stuff. And so that's one piece of it. And the other is FLAC, right? Rather than trying to keep my information from getting out there, I can just make sure that lots of fake information gets out there. When I was a graduate student, we had a little fishbowl where everyone would just toss their grocery shopping card, and you'd pick a random one up and go and shop, because we didn't like the idea of groceries tracking what we were doing. And so we figured we'd kind of randomize it that way. When you fill out a survey, there's no reason they need to know real information about you. You can always kind of create multiple identities or multiple information about yourself and throw it out there. So if there's enough FLAC, then it's harder to tell which of the stuff is real and which of it's not. There's even plugins for your browser that go out and visit random places so that they get a weird track for where you're going, and it's not clear for which of those you were actually looking at the screen and which of them were randomly generated, just to kind of create a lot of noise that is a little more difficult for people to get through. Can we roll this back? If we do enough of this policy side and do enough of the personal side, can we kind of get the genie back in the bottle and protect some more of our privacy? No. I really don't think that's going to happen. I think it's a one-way function. I think as we lose this, we lose privacy overall, and I think we probably lose a lot of these protections. And as I said, I think we probably won't use the term privacy moving forward as much as we have in the past. I think it's a little bit outdated as an idea or a set of ideas. So I don't think we can reclaim privacy, at least in the way that many of us think about it. Although, that, as I said, that's pretty ambiguous, right? How we think about what privacy is. One possibility that, there are some possibilities to fight this, and that is to say, my legislators don't care very much about my privacy but they seem to care a great deal about their own privacy and the privacy of their families. So making clear that if my privacy is gone, yours should be too, is one way to go about this. And so there's some folks who talk about surveillance instead of surveillance. Surveillance is looking at things from above, but we can also use the same kinds of technologies to try to track and find out what our leaders are doing and make sure that they are not doing it undercover. And so, at the most extreme case, that's something like WikiLeaks. But in smaller ways too, we can observe, we can have our own surveillance cameras. We can do a lot of that looking up at the people who have power and using those same tools that they use to better control them instead of them controlling us. So that's one possibility. David Brin talks about this as reciprocal transparency. That is, I don't have a problem with my entire neighborhood being covered in cameras as long as it's not just the police that have access to those cameras, as long as all of us have access to those cameras. I think that it's good for police officers to be carrying to have body cameras, as long as it's anybody that can have access to that, not just the police department. So, one way to solve this is to say privacy is dead, but if it's going to be dead, it's going to be dead for everyone. That there has to be transparency across the board. I think that's probably the more likely path, and I think probably from an activist from the position of an activist, that if I wanted to make both technical and policy changes, my emphasis is not going to be on creating new protections. I think that's important, but I don't think that is what I would emphasize. I would emphasize ending privacy for those who have more power. So that if I'm going to have my privacy taken away, I just want to make sure that it's fairly taken away from everybody else too, especially those who plan on using that information against me. So I think that the antidote to the loss of privacy and to surveillance is transparency.